Hi, everyone. In this week's video, I wanted to discuss the return on investment for your diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. I'm often asked this question, Carolina, how are we going to know if our efforts are successful in this area? How are we going to know if our investment and our dollars, the time, the effort that we're going to put into these initiatives is actually paying off? Valid question. So before we can actually answer that question, we have to understand how we approach this work. So typically when I'm going into diversity, equity, and inclusion engagement, I'm looking at it from two different perspectives: the people piece and then processes and policies of all the different functional areas. So first, in order to be able to measure the return on investment, you have to understand your baseline. And so for some organizations that haven't done any work in this area, the first place to start is to assess your baseline. When it comes to the people piece, that can be done through an assessment. So what you're doing there is you're actually sending out a survey to all employees, all staff, to understand their perspectives of how they view diversity, equity, and inclusion within the organization. That means, do they feel that leadership is committed to this? Do they feel like there's a direction, there's a plan, there's a statement as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion? Do they feel like they're in an inclusive environment where their ideas, who they are, is respected? They don't have to hide who they are. Do they feel like they experience microaggressions? Do they feel like they experience harassment? So all of these different questions probe into the type of culture and environment that your employees are experiencing. So that gives you a baseline of how they're seeing the situation now. And then you can assess through your different interventions whether or not you're successful. In other words, if you introduce an educational component or training or some kind of facilitated conversation and discussion to help move people along, whether it's their understanding of their biases, for example. So anything like that, then you want to measure and be looking at if your assessment is tracking a progress in that particular question that you asked as it related to that particular piece. And the first year, when you're establishing your baseline, your plan in terms of what interventions you're going to use to move the needle usually come from the results of the assessment, because there you can see areas that you're doing well in and some areas where you might, as an organization, need some work and support. So that's the people piece. When it comes to the policies and the processes that each of your functional areas are doing, that's where you start taking a look at, and if you're doing this for the very first time, even looking at how you apply a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens to your policies and processes might be challenging. So that's where first adopting that perspective to define what your baseline is the exploration. I'll give you a very simple example, and then you use that kind of lens looking at every single functional area. So for example, if we were looking at your procurement department, we would look at who are all the vendors that your organization is working with? And then within all the vendors that your organization is working with, can you identify your baseline spend in each of the dimensions of diversity? So for example, minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses. So you start understanding where your spend is, and maybe you really notice that's where you might have some awareness and aha moments about what your baseline is, in order to then be able to attach some metrics to it. So maybe you would like to see, in the next year, a 5% spend in one or two of those categories or what have you. So that's where you start. First is understanding your baseline in order to then be able to attach some metrics, understanding that your metrics may be qualitative and quantitative. And as I mentioned before, your first year when you're doing these assessments and these audits of your processes and policies, you're going to be able to see where you're starting from to be able to then identify gaps, and those gaps call for certain interventions. And then you can measure the success of those interventions by either redoing your survey or assessment if it relates to the people aspect of it, or how you've met certain goals. So whether it's a 5% increase in whatever goal you had, or a qualitative measure of something that you'd like to see improved in a policy or a process of a particular functional area. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of guidance of how you can approach this process within your organization to be able to see the return on investment for your DEI efforts.